Good morning. Today, our special lecture, we have an honor to receive Ambassador Prada or Gustavo Martin Prada. He's a former EU ambassador in New York or in the United Nations. And as I told you before that he's very important because he worked in the European Commission, the EU, for over 37 years. And most of the time he was in the Development Corporation or DEFCO, and DEFCO is important organization who design the financial assistance and financial aid to the Global South, and also Thailand received a lot of money from DEFCO in the case of refugee assistance, humanitarian assistance, and also capacity building, the southern of Thailand, democracy building, for example. And also his last diplomat post is the EU ambassador to the UN, New York. And this is going to link to the lecture today because he is a key person who framed and in the committee of this Agenda 2030 or the SDG of the UN. And to the lecture will be on the EU as a global player, SDGs and global governance. Okay, let's hear it from Ambassador Prada.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for your introduction and for your kind invitation to be here today. It's a real pleasure to be in this university. And I will try to explain to you today why the European Union is a global player and the role of the European Union in negotiating and setting up the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which are, in my opinion, a key aspect of global governance, and also something that we achieved in 2015 when the world was a different place, and that would be very difficult if we were to try to achieve the same results today. But let me start by a small introduction about the European Union. I'm sure you all know more or less what the European Union is, but the important aspect that I would like to emphasize today is the fact that the European Union is different from most international organizations, you know. Actually, the European Union cannot be considered an international organization like the United Nations agencies or ASEAN or the African Union. There are many international organizations, but the European Union is, as some people say, a different animal. It's an unidentified political object, in the sense that in many ways it is closer to a state, to a country, than to an international organization. Most international organizations, you know, are based on the rule of unanimity. For example, in ASEAN, nothing happens if every single member country of ASEAN doesn't agree. Well, that's not the case in the European Union, because for the EU, member states have transferred sovereignty in many areas, and it is done in an irrevocable way. So when the EU speaks on behalf of member states, she doesn't need always to have the authorization of member states, because it's a supranational body, it's not an international one. And that's important in many respects, but in particular when it comes to international negotiations. Because in many fora, including in the UN, but starting with the WTO, with the World Trade Organization, in many fora the European Union speaks, negotiates, and replaces member states. So member states in these negotiations, for example, in the case of the SDGs, they don't speak. It is the EU that speaks on behalf of our 27 before 28 member states. So this nature of the EU of being supranational has implications for its international role. And already since the 60s, in areas like trade policy or development policy, progressively also in terms of regulatory policies, the EU has become an actor in itself, and in the case of trade, an actor as important as the United States and other big economies in the world. The reason, of course, is that the European single market, so the market of the 27 member states, is, together with the US and China, the largest market in the world. And because the EU manages this market, it gives it an international role in trade, investment, and other economic negotiations. Being an actor, unlike an international organization, and also unlike a normal country, so it's something in between, if you wish, the EU has some specific characteristics that you could call the DNA of the EU that it carries with it in all international negotiations. And I would mention two characteristics that are something that differentiate the EU from other actors. The first being the wish always of the EU to have international agreements, international treaties, that disputes or negotiations are based on the rule of law and not on the rule of the jungle. So the EU never tries to take unilateral measures. It always wants to have a negotiation and an agreement. In that, of course, it's rather different from the United States. So that's one element, rule of law, negotiations, treaties, not unilateral measures. The second characteristic is its emphasis on multilateralism. So the EU is always trying to find a multilateral solution to problems and not a unilateral one. This is intrinsic of the European Union as an international, as a global player. And it happens because the EU itself is a result of an international treaty, international rules agreed by EU member states, and the EU itself is a multilateral entity. So for us, it's totally natural, if you wish, that we interact with the rest of the world in the same way, multilaterally and based in the rule of law. Of course, as the EU has been built up over now 7 decades through different treaties, the last one being the Lisbon Treaty, in different areas of international activity, the EU has different powers, different competences. In some areas, the EU has exclusive competence. That's, for example, the case of trade. When it comes to trade, only the EU can speak on behalf of the 27 member states. In the WTO, which is the most important international trade body, EU member states, including France and Germany and big member states, they just don't speak. Never. It's only the European Commission that can speak on trade matters. In another area of international negotiations, which is development and global governance, you have situations in which the EU speaks and other situations in which member states speak. So the EU is competent, normally speaks on behalf of member states, but it has to agree with them what it's going to say. There are other areas of international relations where the EU, even without speaking, is establishing international norms and standards. If you think about, for example, technical standards, 5G, or you think about health and sanitary standards, which food can be traded and enter the European market, for many years it is the EU that establishes rules, and those rules are not only applied by the EU, but they are applied by anyone, including Thai companies, that want to export to the EU. And because European standards tend to be the most strict, the most stringent in the world, whether it's environment or consumer protection or health, they tend to be applied by other countries. So this is not the result of a treaty, because there are no common rules in the world in many areas, unfortunately, but it is the EU that in a way replaces this lack of rules by what nowadays many professors in the world call the Brussels effect. The Brussels effect is the fact that although companies and other countries outside the EU are not obliged to use European rules, they tend to do it because they consider the European rules to be the most strict. So if you are a multinational and you want to trade all over the world, you don't want to have 20 different rules for your products. So you tend to use the stricter one, because with that you can enter any other market. And it so happens that the stricter rules normally come from the EU. The same it's true, or the other reasons, apart from being stricter, is that the EU, of course, is a very large market, so companies have to operate also in the EU, even if the US, China are also important markets. They cannot forget the EU and the EU market, and therefore they have to apply those rules. And a third reason why they do that is because in many cases EU rules are considered to be the best in the sense of the more balanced. Normally when you are regulating a market, you have to take different aspects into account: the interests of the consumers, the interests of the companies, the interests of importers, the interests of exporters. And the EU, as it is a result of negotiations between 27 countries, already when they produce a standard, it's considered by the rest of the world as the more balanced, the more suitable to be applied. So for these reasons, in that area, there are, in many cases, no international rules, but the European Union rules act as if they were the international ones. And then you have another aspect of European actorness in the world, which is foreign policy. And there, of course, we are in a completely different arena from trade. I was telling you that in trade, the EU has exclusive competence. In the case of foreign policy, of course, European member states, including important members of the Security Council like France, they remain competent in the area of foreign policy. So the European Union can only act when there is unanimity. This is not the case in economic areas like trade or regulatory aspects. There, everything is decided by majority. But in the case of foreign policy, it has to be a unanimous decision of EU member states that then allow the European Union to go to New York and negotiate on behalf of our member states. But they have to agree unanimously. So I'm telling you all this because it's important to understand that depending on which area we are talking about, the European Union will be a different player. Either a totally autonomous player or a player that needs the agreement of its member states. When it comes to the discussion of today, the Sustainable Development Goals, you have a rather complex situation because the European Union as such is not a member of the United Nations. Only countries can be members of the United Nations. However, when we are discussing development, and SDGs is part of the global development discussion, the EU, in most cases, I would say in 90% of the cases, speak on behalf of member states. So when you go to the United Nations to a negotiation like this, what we have is a previous coordination with our member states. And then when we go to the meeting, it's only the EU that speaks, not member states. But they retain the competence, so they have to agree what we are going to say. So there is in our office in New York, there is a continuous process of coordination with our member states before we enter the room of the General Assembly or the ECOSOC, and then we speak. They don't speak. And this is how, and now I move to, after this introduction, where I try to explain you why the EU is special animal, I enter into the issue of Agenda 2030, the SDGs, and all the related negotiations that has happened during 10 years, between 2010 and 2020. So it's not only, this negotiation that was extremely complex, was not only about agreeing 17 SDGs or 169 targets or 248 indicators. This is part of the story. We also have to agree two other important elements that were more difficult to negotiate and agree even than the SDGs, and without which the SDGs would not have the same importance. And these two other elements that were negotiated, one was the means of implementation, meaning one thing is to agree on the 17 goals on poverty, on health, on education, on inequalities, on infrastructure, on environment, etc., all the 17 SDGs, but you also have to agree how this is going to be implemented. Or to put it in a different way, who's going to pay for it? And that was, as you can imagine, a negotiation that was far more difficult than agreeing on the goals themselves. And apart from negotiating in parallel the means of implementation that led to an international agreement in Addis Ababa, it's called the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which, as I said, was more difficult to agree than the SDGs themselves. We also have to agree on a total revamping of the United Nations development system to make it fit for the purpose of implementing the SDGs. So we have to agree first the goals, SDGs, second how we are going to finance them and implement them, and third, how we have to change the UN to make it possible that UN would play a leading role in the implementation. Well, this is easier said than done. I spent 10 years of my life doing that, and I can tell you that it was a very, very complex negotiation. Now, why are the SDGs important, and why are they different from the old MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals? Well, the Millennium Development Goals were only about social issues, issues like poverty, health, education. But they were very limited when it comes to economic issues. And by economic issues, I mean issues like infrastructure. And they were even more limited when it came to environmental issues, climate change. And they say nothing at all about more political issues, institutional issues, peace and security issues. So the novelty of the SDGs was to enlarge the international agenda to include not only social issues, classical development issues, but also economic, environmental, climate, and more political issues. Of course, and I will tell you later more about that, there was a lot of resistance in many countries about this enlargement of the agenda. Some countries thought that by including so many things, we will never be able to agree a common agenda. All the 193 countries of the UN will never be able to agree the moment you include conflictual issues in the international agenda, like political issues or climate issues. Others did not want to enlarge the agenda because they thought that enlarging the agenda was a way for developed countries to avoid investing on development assistance. And that they thought that we wanted to include these issues like climate change that are very close to our heart. And that by doing that, we will put less emphasis on classical development issues. Other critics of the agenda thought that this was a way of introducing a level of global governance that they were not willing to accept, in the sense that this would give the UN the possibility of discussing many issues that traditionally has not been included in one package at the United Nations level. And it was not only developing countries. There were some developed countries, like the EU or the US, that, for example, did not want issues like taxation of multinationals to be included in this agenda. So that was a big discussion in the Addis Ababa agenda. We wanted international rules on taxation of multinationals, but we didn't want it to be at the UN. We wanted it to be at the OECD. And like that, other countries, India, Japan, China, they wanted some things on the agenda, but not others. In reality, what we were discussing, although it was not put like this during the 10 years of the negotiation, we were discussing a global blueprint for international governance. We were discussing, in many ways, the future role of the United Nations in many areas. And of course, this was something that made some countries uncomfortable for different reasons. Well, after 5 years of negotiation between 2010 and 2015, we finally agreed in New York the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We also agreed in Addis Ababa also in 2015 the agenda for the means of implementation. And 3 years later, we agreed in New York the reform of the UN development system to implement all this. So why I mentioned there the EU as a global player, and I make a link between the SDGs and global governance? Well, because the SDGs are probably the most ambitious ever global agreement, the most comprehensive agreement on global governance that the international community has been capable of achieving. Never before the international community, all 193 members of the United Nations, was capable or even tried to have such an agreement, not only of the goals and targets and indicators, but more importantly, to discuss the trade-offs between these goals, to discuss the interlinkages between these goals, because of course they are related. If you talk about economic growth and environment, there is a clear trade-off between the two. One could say that what it was achieved in Agenda 2030 in 2015 is the summit in global governance in the history of the United Nations. Never before we could agree in such a detailed level about how we all wanted the world to be in 15 years' time, in 2030. Before I enter into the discussion of the SDGs, I think I will rather stop here and ask you to ask me questions about what I said, or criticize what I've just said, or show your displeasure or your doubts about what I've said so far. And please don't be shy. I like criticism.
I can start with one question if you don't mind.
Sure.
So, in addition to the MDG to SDG, so that you said that there's a political issue, economic issue included in that. But if I ask about the perspective of the European citizen, do you think the SDGs are worth more the money that the EU spend on the world? Because, like, for example, yesterday the EU just donated money, like 3.5 million euro to Thailand, and an organization in Thailand to develop the SDG. But that money is quite a big sum of money, and it could be used to develop healthcare or supporting European Union citizens within the EU itself. So, if perspective of the EU citizen, do you think it's a good move to do that?
Well, thank you. It's a very good question. Because what you're asking about goes beyond the SDGs. What you're asking about is whether the European citizen is happy with the EU donating around 15 billion euros every year in the development assistance. Not so much to Thailand, because Thailand is a relatively rich country, so here we are talking about small amount of money. But particularly in Africa, the EU is spending roughly 15 billion every year. And you may say, and rightly so, that a lot of European citizens may think that this money could be better spent in hospitals or schools or nowadays in electricity bills rather than in development assistance. Well, you will be surprised. We have something called the Eurobarometer, which is a survey, a poll done, I think it's every 6 months in Europe, asking all sorts of questions to thousands of Europeans. One of the questions is always, in which area you would like the EU to do more than we are doing now? Or in which areas you think it's important that the European Union acts, internally or internationally? And development assistance is always at the top of the list. So in every of these surveys, there are 80% or more of people that say that they would like the EU to do even more. So, although I can understand very well your question, and I know people that say that, what you said, why not spending it at home? The majority, the overwhelming majority of Europeans are happy with the EU doing development assistance, and actually they would like us to do even more. Of course, there is another debate that is linked to your question, and this is the debate about whether development assistance is effective. Does it work? Is development assistance helping developing countries do better or not? Which is not the same as your question, but it's related. There are some people in Europe that are in favor of developing cooperation, and yet they believe that the money spent is not well spent. They could be doing better with so much money. And that's an open debate. But when it comes to your question, when it comes to are Europeans happy about the EU doing that, the answer is clearly yes.
Another thing is that there is a statement saying that the SDG is not going far enough and probably cannot achieve the goal by 2030. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, I will answer you the question next, because I was going to move into that, whether the SDGs are worth the effort, whether outside of the United Nations building in New York, people care about the SDGs, people believe that the SDGs are going to be implemented, and that's quite an interesting discussion. I can tell you that when I started working on this 10 years ago, my answer to your question would have been not really. Because I was coming to these negotiations at the UN from a background of trade negotiations. I used to work a lot in the WTO and in bilateral trade agreements. And of course, there is a fundamental difference between trade negotiations and the SDGs. In trade negotiations, when you sign a deal, a free trade agreement or a regional trade agreement or a multilateral agreement at WTO, you have to do it. You promise to do something and you have to do it. It's obligatory, it's compulsory. It's not something that you do if you feel like doing it, or if you change your mind, you don't do it. It's like a contract in private law. SDGs is totally different. Nobody, no country, has an obligation to do what the SDGs say. The SDGs are voluntary, they are aspirational. It is something that all countries in the world have decided we would like the world in 2030 to be like that, and by agreeing to that, they have a moral commitment to do their utmost to improve the situation in their respective countries, to make it possible that the world will achieve the SDGs. But nobody is obliged. Nobody can go to a court of law and sue the Thai government or the French government because they are not doing enough for achieving the SDGs. It's an aspiration, it's an objective, it's a goal, but it's not an obligation. So in that sense, when I first started working on this, I was asking myself the same question you have. What are the SDGs worth? What is an agreement at the UN level worth when there is no possibility of dispute settlement, there is no possibility of having recourse in case a country or a company doesn't do enough to achieve the goals? Well, over these 10 years, I have changed my mind. And I've changed my mind in the sense that although they are not binding, although they are not obligatory, although there is no a treaty with a dispute settlement, they are, you could say, they are just declaratory. It's a declaration. There is something that one should not underestimate, and this is the role in all countries, in different ways, of civil society, and the role of NGOs, and the role of the press, and the role of UN monitoring mechanisms, name and shame. All countries have to go periodically to the UN to explain what they are doing in order to achieve these goals. They are being compared with other countries. For instance, the day Thailand or Spain goes to the UN to explain what they are doing, the press, the local press, sometimes even the international press, is watching. And there is a lot of not only peer pressure, but also competition between different countries to show they are good pupils. Whenever there is a report on the implementation of the SDGs in all countries, I don't know about Thailand, but I'm sure also in Thailand, the press will criticize the government, saying, look at this, in SDG, whatever, health, we are doing less well than Vietnam. And this puts a lot of pressure, of course, more in democracies than in other systems, but in all systems, the government is put constantly under pressure because the press is showing that in this or the other area, they are doing less well than their neighbors. And although, again, it's not obligatory, it's not compulsory, governments feel pressure through their civil society, that civil society in many countries, I don't know in Thailand, but probably they do reports themselves showing that Thailand or any other country is doing well here, but it's doing badly there. Of course, NGOs are extremely attentive to what countries are doing in areas like environment or climate change. So yes, governments are not obliged, but they are put constantly under pressure to show that they are doing what they have promised. So the question is not so much, are we going to achieve the SDGs? Because if you ask me today, my answer would be, I don't think so. I don't think that by 2030, every country in the world will have eliminated extreme poverty. I don't think so. We knew it already during the negotiations. We knew that we were being extremely ambitious in many of the goals. But then, apart from what you negotiate, there is events that happen in the world. For instance, nobody thought in 2015 that we will have a pandemic that will shut down the world economy for the better part of 2 years. This was obviously something that we didn't expect. And yet, this has had a clear implication on health, of course, but also on education. In many countries, schools and universities were closed for months. In some countries, for instance, a country I know well, Argentina, schools were closed during 1 year and a half. And of course, there were online classes, Zoom and all that, but there were many people that were too poor to have access to an internet connection or a Zoom app or a computer. So clearly the pandemic has a lot of impact on how we are going to achieve the sustainable, the SDG on education, but also on poverty. When the pandemic closed down the global economy for several months, there were over 100 million people that fell into poverty. These were people that have left poverty before and went back to being poor because they couldn't work. So the objectives were, to start with, very ambitious, and then we have a pandemic, and now we have a war, at least in Europe, which is having not only terrible consequences for the populations of Ukraine and in a different way Russia, but also, and of course Europe in terms of the price of energy, but also for developing countries, particularly in terms of the price of energy and the price of food. So there again, this goes against the objectives that we agreed in the SDGs. So if in 2015 all this was already very ambitious, obviously the chances that by 2030 all countries in the world are going to reach the SDGs objectives is rather small. And the pandemic and the war has clearly made it even smaller. But although this is clearly the case, I think the important is for the world to continue seeing the SDGs as an objective to be achieved. Maybe not fully, maybe not by 2030, but it remains the blueprint, the benchmark for most governments in the world. And maybe they will not be achieved in 2030, maybe some of them will be achieved and not others, maybe they will be achieved in some countries and not others, but what is important, and the UN is working a lot on that, and the European Union as well, is to keep them as the objective to reach, and to continue putting pressure on governments. And for people that have been working on global governance issues, particularly at the UN, they have never seen the popularity of a UN agreement that you see when it comes to the SDG. Every September, and also every July in New York, when there is the monitoring of the SDGs, or every September when there is the General Assembly, the whole New York is paralyzed, not only because there are so many heads of state and diplomats there, but also because the NGOs come to town, block the whole city, You cannot go anywhere in New York where you don't have the SDGs surrounding you. Concerts are organized in Central Park where you have 1 million people. Nothing like that has ever happened in any UN negotiation or UN agreement. So there is a level of popularity of the SDGs that help the EU and the UN to keep them on the agenda. Of course, you are right, when 2030 comes, a lot of people will come criticizing the SDGs, saying this was not worth the effort, they were not achieved. This will happen for sure. But the idea that the whole international community has a common objective is something that one should not underestimate. When one sees what's happening today in Ukraine, when one analyzes the growing acrimonious disputes between China and the US, it gives even more value to say, well, at least the international community could agree on that and maintain this blueprint, this benchmark, as a common objective. I really wish we could have that in many other areas, even if by 2030 it is not fully implemented. Now, why do I make the link between the EU as global player and the SDGs and global governance? I do it because the SDGs was, first of all, an idea of the European Union. It was the European Union that, when the discussion started in 2010, 2011 in New York about what will come after the Millennium Development Goals, and most people at the time thought that we should have a revision of the Millennium Development Goals and nothing else. It was an idea of the European Union that we have to be ambitious, that we have to have a much more comprehensive international agreement, and that this new comprehensive international agreement should include environmental issues, economic issues, climate change issues, political issues. At the time, nobody was thinking about this. So to start with, it was the European Union that was at the origin of the idea, and then during the negotiations, it was the European Union, together with the UN, of course, that was the motor in this negotiation. It was very difficult when you look at the whole agenda, the SDGs, the means of implementation, and later the reform of the UN development system. You have all countries in the world, and I think I'm not exaggerating, all countries in the world that were against it. Not against the SDGs, but against one part or the other of the agenda. As I said at the beginning, the SDGs was the easiest part of the agenda. The difficult parts were, okay, we agreed that this would be nice, now how we do it, and who pays for that, and how UN has to be totally reformed in order to achieve that. Of this whole global package, I would say every important country was against one part of the agenda or against another part of the agenda. So the EU, hand in hand with the UN, have to convince all of them. Let me give you examples. The US was not against the SDGs. They thought they were not very important for the reasons you mentioned, but nobody cares about the MDGs, and SDGs is going to be similar. So it's not very important. But when the discussion moved from the SDGs to the reform of the UN, There, the US was totally against. Why? Because the original proposal from the Secretary General of the UN, from Antonio Guterres, was that the reform of the UN development system is going to cost money. And this money is going to come from what in New York it's called assessed contributions. Assessed contributions are the contributions of the members of the UN that are paid automatically to the UN every year. There are two types of financing of the United Nations. Assessed contributions based on the size of the country, the size of the economy, and therefore the United States is the main contributor to the UN through assessed contributions, and then voluntary contributions. And voluntary contributions is normally how you finance the agencies of the UN. UNESCO, UNICEF, FAO, UNDP, all their function, all their activities are financed through voluntary contribution from different countries, mostly European countries, but not all. More and more, Japan, China. So when the discussion of the reform of the UN development system came to the point of how we are going to pay for this, and this was costing not so much, but it was over $300 million, because we were creating a new, different position of resident coordinator of the UN. Resident coordinator is the representative of the UN in each country. This was expensive, not so much, $300 million, but the Americans knew that they would have to pay 30% of that. And so they were totally against. And of course, at the time, we already had Donald Trump as president of the United States, who was saying that he was going to cut the contribution of the US to different UN bodies. Therefore, he was not enthusiastic about having to pay even more for this reform. But it was not only the US, other countries were against, as I said, different parts. For instance, Russia was basically against the whole agenda, because in the UN, Russia has traditionally a position of maintaining the status quo, not changing anything. They are very comfortable with their position of having, of course, a veto right in the Security Council. It's one of the 5 members of the Security Council that can veto any decision of the Security Council. But more generally, they do not want changes in the UN, and in particular, they did not want that these new resident coordinators of the UN, by using the SDGs, this wide agenda, including political issues, could say things that Russia didn't like. So they were also against. The same was true of the G77. I don't know if you are familiar with the concept of the G77. G77 is a group of developing countries that in New York, they negotiate together. They are called G77 for historical reasons, because they are no longer 77 countries. There were 77 countries a long time ago. Nowadays, there are more than 120 developing countries. They are called G77 and China. China is a member, but it's so important that you have to name it separately. Well, the G77 and China, again, were not very interested in this agenda for different reasons. When it comes to the SDGs, the G77 thought that there will be a dilution away from the issues they care about, which are poverty, which are health, education, into issues that are of interest for more developed countries. For example, climate change, or for example, environmental issues, or for example, good governance. They thought that they would lose out if the agenda was enlarged. That about the SDGs. When it comes to the means of implementation, they were afraid that this was being used by the European Union and other developed countries to give less development assistance. They say if the agenda becomes so large, the EU and Japan and the US, the main donors, will focus their money on the new issues like climate change, and they will forget the traditional development issues like health, education, poverty. So they were also against part of the agenda. Japan was in favor of the SDGs, but it was quite reluctant to accept the reform of the UN development system for one rather small reason, and this is that Japan has traditionally been very closely associated with the UNDP, the UN Development Program. And historically, the resident coordinator of the United Nations in every country was also the representative of UNDP. So UNDP was the largest UN agency present in all developing countries, and therefore it was the representative of the UNDP that was also representing all the other agencies of the UN. They have this coordinating role. And Japan, which is very fond of the UNDP, they didn't want UNDP to lose this role. So they were also reluctant on the third part of the agenda. At the very end of the negotiation on the reform of the UN development system, India was against, but that was for financial reasons. They wanted to make sure that as the result of the negotiation was that we were not going to use assessed contributions, that the new resident coordinator system will be financed through voluntary contributions. They wanted to make sure that there would be enough money for that. Who was going to pay these 300 million voluntarily every year? And not only that, we have included in the agreement a clause which we call a tax. And that works like that. Every country, for instance, the European Union, when we give money to Thailand or to any country, we have to take 1% of that and give it to the UN for the funding of their new system of resident coordinators. So a lot of countries, developing countries, thought that they will end up paying for it because that was money that would be sent to developing countries, and now it will be sent to the UN for them to pay this new reform. So for these different reasons, in 2015, when we agreed the SDGs and the Addis Ababa action agenda on means of implementation, or in 2018, when we agreed the reform of the UN development system, everyone was against one part of the other. The US, China, Russia, G77, so all developing countries, Japan. It was only the EU who wanted this agenda. And well, the interesting thing is that it was accepted. So clearly, the EU not only has the idea that this was good for the UN and for the world, but it managed to overcome the resistance of every, or almost every, country of the UN, and over 10 years managed to agree on this global agenda. So clearly the EU show in the negotiations of the SDG that it is not only a global player, but it's a global player that is important enough for the rest of the world to accept in the end, after months and years of discussions, that it was good for the world to have this comprehensive global agenda. Agenda that, although not fully implemented by 2030, as I said before, will remain a common agreed objective for the whole world. Now, of course, I assume most of you have never been to a negotiation in the UN, whether it is in the General Assembly or in the ECOSOC. But for you to understand why I'm emphasizing the role of the EU, you can see visually when a negotiation starts, every day that people gather in this building that you see on TV every September because your president or prime minister goes to the UN to make a speech, and you see this green marble where he's speaking. This is the General Assembly building. When you enter this room to discuss any of these issues, normally the UN takes the floor, opens the meeting, and the first two entities that are invited to speak are the G77 and the European Union. Contrary to what you may think, it's not the US, it's not China. All negotiations at the UN on these issues, not in the Security Council, of course, but on these issues, are a dialogue, almost bilateral dialogue, between G77 and the EU. After they speak, other members, like the US, like China, like India, like Brazil, are invited to speak. But clearly, already in the choreography of the negotiation, we all know that if the G77 and the EU can agree, well, that's already half of the solution of the problem. You still have to convince the others. But EU and G77 is 150 countries out of 190. So you already have 70% of the countries accepting the deal. And that, of course, gives the EU a particular role, because all the other countries, developed countries, they know that this functions like this, so they come to the EU with their ideas. And that is not only Switzerland or Norway or nowadays the UK, which is no longer a member of the EU. So this is not only the European countries that are closely related to the EU, but it's also Australia, it's also New Zealand, it's also Japan, it's also Korea, it's also the US. We have many meetings with the US to try to understand what they want and try to convince the G77 about, if we agree, of the logic of the thing. So that gives the EU and the UN a very special role. And there is a difference with the G77, because normally the European Union, as I told you in our building in New York, we have every day from 8 o'clock in the morning to 8 o'clock in the evening, coordinating meetings with our member states on all these topics. It's like a factory. All the time we are having these meetings. So when we go to the General Assembly or to the ECOSOC, we have a very clear line agreed by all the European countries. That's much more difficult for the G77, because there you have countries that are very active, countries like India or countries like Brazil. But then you have others which are much less active. for different reasons, either because they are not so interested about this negotiation, or because they have very small missions in New York. So they physically cannot cover all these negotiations. There are countries, for instance, small islands in the Pacific or in the Caribbean, that maybe they have 3-4 people in New York. And in a normal day of these negotiations, you have 20 meetings, many at the same time. So they can just not cover them all. So the G77 needs a lot of time to come to positions that can be accepted by all members. And then you have a group of countries that are very different. It's very little in common between Vanuatu and China, or between Singapore and China. Not only because they have different interests, is that they have a approach, a policy, an attitude towards the UN and these issues which is totally different. Some countries only care about one specific topic. For instance, Pacific Islands, they care a lot about climate change for obvious reasons, but they don't care so much about the other 16 SDGs. China, of course, cares about the whole agenda, but has positions in issues that are more political, institutional, rule of law, good governance internally, which are very different from India. So with all this difference in size, in interests, in objectives, it's very difficult for the G77 to have a very solid position for these 120 countries. So when it comes to the negotiation at the UN, you have one group, the European Union, which has a very clear line, even on paper, several pages, and you have a G77 that is continuously trying to agree a line. And it is not unusual that once the G77 has spoken, some members of the G77 will speak separately and say, oh yes, that is very good, I agree with the G77, however, what I really care about is this, or what I don't like is that, which of course undermines, weakens the position in the negotiation of the G77. So for all these reasons, at the end of the day, one could say, although it's a bit exaggerated, that is, in most cases, it is the EU that is running the show. And this is why one can understand that the EU managed to convince the whole world about having this blueprint for global governance, having this comprehensive set of SDGs, having these ambitious means of implementation, and accepting the reform of the UN development system. Now I have spoken about countries, members of the UN, but you have also to understand that when we were discussing the reform of the UN development system, you have 40 UN agencies, UNDP, UNESCO, UNICEF, FAO, 40 that have very different agendas and very different structures and governing bodies and funding. So each of them was trying to protect not only their territory, but also their activities. And each of them have special link, special relationship with some country. I mentioned before that UNDP is very close to Japan, but of course UNESCO is very close to France, and depending on where the institution is located, and also depending on who is the Secretary General of the institution, they have countries that will lobby on their behalf. So you also have to take into account this huge diversity of UN agencies when you go into a negotiation like this. You are not only negotiating as European Union with the United States or with Japan or with Russia, you are also negotiating with individual agencies of the UN that have specific vested interests. Well, all that to give you an idea of how difficult it is to have these agreements, and that's why it takes 10 years. But the main message for you today is that the EU managed to show, in this case very clearly, that as a global player, it can have a substantial impact on global governance. Of course, this was 2015. You could ask yourself another question. What if we have to negotiate this today? Would it be possible? Of course, a counterfactual question, we don't know, but I think it's quite obvious to me that it will be extremely difficult, maybe impossible, to have the same agreement today. Or for that matter, to have the same agreement in 2030, when we will have to renegotiate this agenda again. Why? Well, first of all, for obvious reasons, that the world has changed, and it has changed in a way which is not conducive to international cooperation. In 2015, it would have been simply unthinkable that there would be war in Europe. Nobody could have predicted that what's happening today in Ukraine will be happening, and that many other countries in the world, apart from Russia and Ukraine, are deeply involved in this war, which of course creates an atmosphere at the UN and in all international discussions that is not the most conducive to finding compromises and finding agreements. But probably even more complicated than that would be the rather low level of the relationship between the US and China. Clearly, there is, well, there are many things one could say there, but for this discussion, which is important to say, is that it's a growing lack of trust, a growing lack of cooperation, and in some cases, a growing acrimonious discussion in many areas between the US and China that would make such a negotiation extremely complicated. Because in a negotiation like that, the first thing you need is that although you may not have agreement at the beginning, you need all countries, especially important countries, to be on the same page, to be willing to compromise, to be willing to do trade-offs and to reach an agreement. I suspect that would be very difficult today between the US and China. And without the US and China on board, this will be very, very difficult. So before I come to the conclusion, I would like to stop again and ask you to please ask me questions, disagree with me, criticize what I said, tell me you don't believe the European Union can do all that. Sure.
As you say that no negotiation, especially if EU can agree with the G27 is about half that, because it's including 150 countries. What intriguing me is that G77 from the start is always G77 and China. And I would like to know whether these days is still business as usual or China now no more associated with G77. And as I think aloud, for example, the 12 point peace proposal about Ukraine, even Russia not really, like a lukewarm reception, whereas Belarusia really, fully support something like that. Whether I think there should be any forum that China can kind of rally support before, launching its proposal.
Okay, well, there are two different questions. One is about the role of China in the G77, and the second is the role of China in the current discussions on the future peace, hopefully, in Ukraine. Concerning the G77, it's a rather peculiar animal that has evolved over the years and decades. China was not always a member of G77. Other countries were members of G77 and left. Some countries left completely. Other countries left and then go back. As I used to say to my friends from the G77 in New York, I'm also a member of the G77 because I was born in Argentina, so I am a G77 member. Although Argentina left the G77 in the 90s and then went back in 2005. Some countries consider the G77 as the only possibility they have to have an influence. Small countries, especially least developed countries, although the least developed countries have their own grouping, and they speak on behalf of the LDCs, but as part of the G77. But they have an important role because they have special interests. But these countries, they know that if they are not together in a G77 with countries the like of China and India and Brazil, and big countries, their voice is not heard in the same way. So for these countries, the G77 is their only possibility to have a say in the negotiation. Other countries, the big ones, for example, India, they individually have a voice, an important voice. But they use the G77 to say, I am talking on behalf of 125 countries. So for them, the G77 increases their importance. Although everyone knows that if you want to have an agreement with the G77, you speak to whoever is being the spokesperson of the G77. For instance, during these negotiations, he was the ambassador of Algeria. But you know that apart from that, you have to go for lunch with the Indians, with the Chinese, with countries that, although being small, play a very important role in UN, like Singapore, with countries, Arab countries in the Gulf, depending on the topic. But you know that there are actors that have a specific role within G77, and that, yes, formally you speak to G77, but you also have to talk to them. And normally, at the end of the negotiation, and that was the case in the SDGs, in the means of implementation, Addis Ababa Agreement, and in the agreement on UN reform, when we have a package that has general consensus of the G77, there is always 1, 2, 3 topics that are left for the very end, because they are the most contentious, they are the most difficult, they are red lines for one country or the other. And there you know that you have to go and speak bilaterally with the big boys. In the case of UN reform, for example, the last 2 countries to accept the agenda were China and India. I'm talking about not the SDGs, I'm talking about the reform of the UN that came later. And so we have to work together with the UN to talk to bilaterally with China and India. In this case, the UN handled China and the EU handled India, and get them to agree on the final points. So at that time, G77 as a whole becomes less important, and you need to talk to countries that have the capacity to veto the whole agenda. So G77 is used by some countries to exist, to have a voice, and is used by the big countries to amplify his voice in New York. You could say that G77 as such doesn't exist. And there are many countries in New York that think that it's not important, just a symbol of developing countries. But when it comes to these negotiations, G77 exists and it's important. And you have to have them on board, otherwise nothing, even if the big countries, US, Japan, China, the EU wanted something, if the G77 doesn't agree, it's not going to fly. So you need the G77. You even need to help the G77 to have a common position, because it facilitates the negotiation enormously. If there is infighting in the G77, the whole negotiation becomes much more difficult, because you have a variety of actors that you have to handle. So that was your first question. The second question is about the role of China in the current situation. Of course, I am not qualified to discuss that, not only because I am retired, but also because I'm not working on that. So I don't know the inner discussions there. But of course, we are talking about a completely different discussion from this type of governance discussions in the UN. We are talking about a war. We are talking about a situation in which the UN as such is paralyzed, because the war includes one member of the Security Council, one permanent member of the Security Council, Russia, which has a veto right, so the Security Council cannot agree on anything, it's impossible. You need not only the majority of the Security Council, but you need the agreement of the 5 permanent members, which, as you know, are the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. If you have one of them, in this case Russia, that doesn't agree, that's the end of the discussion. The UN cannot decide anything. And this is why the discussion has moved from the Security Council to the General Assembly. And so the General Assembly periodically votes resolutions criticizing Russian aggression to Ukraine. But again, this is like the SDGs, it's not binding. What is important when it comes to issues of peace and security is the Security Council. And in this case, the Security Council cannot decide anything. So any possibility of having a diplomatic process to solve the conflict has to happen outside the UN. And this is why initiatives like China, some time ago Turkey, and there are many actors trying to come to the beginning of a process of diplomacy leading to the end of the conflict. And as I said, I'm not at all working on that or involved on that, but I can only hope that one initiative or other initiative finally arrives at the possibility of ending the conflict, because that's the best solution for not only the countries involved, but also for the whole world.
And you talk about the, Russia, like normally policy is status quo. But as a matter of fact, that's the point. The UN reform, because China and other countries, especially middle power like India, Brazil, or those with the atomic bomb, they like perhaps no, not permanent, not semi-permanent, something like that. Because even Japan and Germany, who lost the war, then they are not in the big fight since the start. So I think Russia is more active for change the world order that established by the USA after the World War II. So that you say that Russia tends to maintain status quo, seems not really for what.
Yes, you're right. What I said is that when it comes to these discussions about global governance, sustainability, development issues, Russia is for the status quo. And also when it comes to how the UN functions internally, Russia is for the status quo. Clearly, what's happening today in Ukraine is the opposite. Russia is changing the status quo. So don't misunderstand me. In these issues, UN development issues, Russia, I said, is for the status quo. Clearly, what's happening today in Ukraine is not at all respecting the status quo, be it borders and everything that is being violated. So, yes, you're right. There is no defense of the status quo there at all. But I was talking about this part, the small part of the story.
Well, mine is like sharing comments, because you mentioned G77 and thinking about the WTO and the donor round, that all of you knows that India and Brazil seems to be like a big war with G77, but the way that they pursue the free trade agenda is so different, right? As you know, that India was more national, economic nationalism, protectionism, while Brazil is more open to free trade. And sometimes this too is more like, people thought that there would be like a hub of their sub-region, like Brazil for South America and India for Asia, for example. It seems that sometimes they didn't really care about their sub-region interest. They just pursue their own national interest, kind of less brought in. What do you think is
Well, it's a very good example to show that different international fora function in a very different way, and the same country functions totally differently in the UN and WTO. In the WTO, contrary to the UN, the role of the G77 as such is not so important, because traditionally at least until the Uruguay round negotiations in the 90s, WTO was a discussion mostly, almost exclusively, between the EU and the US. Each negotiation of the first, the GATT, as it was called before, and then the WTO, in reality, was a discussion between the EU and the US, and mostly about European agricultural protection. The Kennedy round, the Tokyo round, it was mostly about how to accommodate this new animal that was the European Union. There was a single market that has a common agricultural policy, and this was creating problems for the US. It was also creating problems for developing countries. But in reality, the discussion was EU-US. Then later, we started talking about the Quad. And the Quad was the US, the EU, Canada, and Japan. But again, the role of developing countries in WTO negotiations until the Uruguay round was very limited. And this is not only because their role in international trade was limited, it was also because at the time, during the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, what the GATT was asking from developing countries was very little. There are very few obligations for developing countries in the GATT, and therefore it was not very important for them. This changed with the Uruguay round because, like in the SDGs, in the Uruguay round, we enlarged the agenda. And we have new rules in the WTO on agriculture, on textiles, on intellectual property rights, on public procurement, on many areas in which we ask developing countries to do something. So for them, it was no longer a discussion between the big boys, the US and the EU, but it was a discussion in which all of them have a very big interest because they were asked to respect intellectual property rights, they were asked to respect all the WTO rules, and not only that, the GATT did not have a dispute settlement, or they have panels, but you could ignore them. There was no real sanction if you did not respect the rules of the GATT. Whereas in the case of the WTO, you have a very strong dispute settlement mechanism. And any developing country that will not respect the rules of WTO, for instance, restricting imports, not respecting their tariffs and increasing their tariffs, or not respecting the protection of patents or copyrights, they could be sanctioned. And the EU and the US could take retaliatory measures against them. So that was a completely different change, a completely different situation for them. So after the Uruguay round, developing countries became much more important, and in particular the two you mentioned, India and Brazil. And as you rightly say, Brazil may be in a more open way, India in a more nationalistic, restrictive way. To the point that after the Uruguay round, we have another round of negotiations called the DDA, the Doha Development Agenda, which is the first time in the history that a round in trade negotiations failed. The Doha Development Agenda was never approved, and Of course, there are different opinions about who is responsible for that, but there are a lot of observers that would say that the main villain in that story was India. I would say that in general, developing countries became much more aware of the big issues at stake for them in WTO, and therefore became much more careful, even reluctant, to negotiate things and enlarge the agenda, because they realized that now they were obliged to do that. It's not like the SDGs. Nobody is obliged to the SDGs, but in WTO you are. And that, I think, make developing countries much more active, much more careful. And yes, India, in particular, even more than Brazil, India is the self-appointed leader of the hardliners of developing countries in the WTO. So if before it was a discussion mainly about the US and Europe, or the Quad, nowadays there is a clear quadrilateral discussion between Europe, the US, India and China. Europe, the US, and China, because they are the three largest markets in the world, and that, of course, is important when you're talking about trade negotiations. And then India, because, as I said, is seen as representing the rest of the world. And because India is so difficult in these negotiations, the Doha Development Agenda failed. Which is a big problem, by the way. It has nothing to do with this, but yes, it has to do with global governance. Because in 2000 I was the chief economist of the DG Trade, that is the one that negotiates agreements in the WTO and bilateral agreements for the EU. And I was very involved in the discussions. Well, students here are probably too young for that, but there was something that people my age will remember, and that was the Battle of Seattle. And this is when all NGOs against the WTO went to Seattle to disrupt a ministerial meeting of the WTO. And actually they occupied the whole city. There was the first big demonstration against the WTO. Then it became a habit, and in some cases it even turned violent. In Genoa, in Italy, for instance, also in G7, G8 meetings. So I was at the time in charge of this discussion, and I remember having long conversations with NGOs like Oxfam, ATTAC, many NGOs that were worried about the growing power of the WTO, not only when it comes to trade, but also in issues linked to trade. There have been, and there still are, discussions in WTO on issues like trade and environment, trade and social rights, and NGOs were worried at the time that the WTO was replacing UN and becoming the only forum that was dealing with all important issues, economic, but also others, like social, labor rights, like environment, etc. And they were against this. And in these discussions, I was defending the role of the WTO. And I used to tell these NGOs, but also developing countries that were supporting this anti-WTO movement, I used to tell them that without the WTO, with all these faults and imperfections, but without the WTO, this will be the law of the jungle. And in the law of the jungle, only the big animals can survive. And if one day, as they wished at the time, the WTO will not function, the main to suffer would be developing countries. Because for the US or for the EU, or now for China, that was not the case 20 years ago, we can always protect ourselves. We can always retaliate. We can always come to an agreement bilaterally because we have a big market. But for small countries, WTO was the only forum in which the voice of, say, Costa Rica could go to the dispute settlement, be heard, and win against the United States. There was no other forum in the world where Costa Rica could beat the United States. So I was telling NGOs at the time, not only in developing countries, also in Europe, a lot of NGOs in Europe were anti-WTO. I was telling them, be careful what you wish for, because wishing that the WTO becomes weak, it's probably the worst thing that can happen to those developing countries that you are trying to protect. And unfortunately, I have to say I was right, because that's the situation today. Today, because of the refusal from the Trump administration to renovate the members of the appellate body in the WTO, the dispute settlement of the WTO is out of order. It's not functioning anymore. Because judges that have been, that are retiring from the WTO at the end of their mandate are not being replaced. So now you don't have enough judges in the appellate body for the dispute settlement of the WTO to function. This was clearly a policy of the Trump administration. But even before, there was a general lack of appetite, not only in Washington, but also in New Delhi and in other developing countries, for strengthening the WTO. The result is that today the WTO is in some sort of limbo. And who are the victims of that? It's not the EU, it's not the US, it's not China. It is all the other developing countries that they don't have a forum anymore where they can protect themselves against the bullying of the big boys. So in that sense, and I repeat, unfortunately, I was right when I was telling the NGOs, civil society in Europe and in developing countries, and in India in particular, was very active at that. Careful what you wish for, because if you lose the WTO, then it becomes the law of the jungle. And for big markets like Europe, it's not such a big problem. But it is very bad for small developing countries. And that is the situation where we are now. And this is something that I think in terms of global governance is one of the most important things we have to solve. We have to get the WTO working again. Because if we do not, there's going to be more and more proliferation of bilateral agreements. And in a bilateral agreement between the US or between the EU or between China and small developing countries, there is an asymmetry of power which guarantees that the agreement is going to be in favor of the big one. So a proliferation of bilateral agreements, and even worse, a proliferation of unilateral measures, for instance, like the Trump administration did against China, this is bad for everyone, but it's particularly bad for small developing countries. And I think nowadays, those same NGOs, say Oxfam, they understand that it is in the interest of everyone in particular the weaker members of WTO, to have the WTO functioning again. And we should not forget that 20 years ago, when nobody was caring about the UN, everyone saw the WTO as an example of how global governance can function. In spite of the criticisms from NGOs, every government knew that WTO was by far the most important international organization. Well, unfortunately, this is not so clear today, and this is to the detriment of global governance in general, and particularly to developing countries.
You ambassador to the UN, so I just now not too serious question about whether you met Mahbubani because he was there 10 years in New York, or Nikki Haley, which now the supposedly Republican president candidate. Whether you met them in person and how you interact with them?
Not our Singaporean friend. I know who he is, and I've been in conferences, but it's not that I met him. I did meet Nikki Haley when she was the U.S. ambassador in UN. But let's be clear, when you say I was ambassador in UN, the EU has 3 ambassadors in UN. You have the equivalent of Nikki Haley, and you have the number 2 deputy permanent representative, which is also ambassador, and I was the number 2, so I was not exactly the equivalent of Nikki Haley. But I did meet her, and I have to say I was always impressed by her. Not that I always agree what she has to say, but clearly it's a very intelligent and articulate person.
So,
I don't vote in the United States, so
so better than Trump for the Republican candidate.
Well, if you ask me, I would say yes. But, I'm not a voter in the US or a Republican voter, so I have no comments. But yes, I was positively impressed by Nikki. Actually, the US tends to send very high-profile people as ambassadors to the UN. You know that in the US, it's a ministerial post level. It was Nikki Haley, but it was her predecessor. It was sent by Mr. Obama. I've forgotten her name, but also very high-profile lady. There was Mr. Bolton in the period of Bush. So you always have very high-level ambassadors at the UN. And I will not comment on Mr. Trump.